Hididai, didai, dai, dai, dai. Hididai, dai, 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 didai. Hididai, dai, 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 dai. Ai, dai, dai, didi, dai, dai, dai. Hiri-dan-dai, na-dan-dai, na-dai-dai. Hiri-dan-dai, di-dan-dai, di-dai. Hiri-dan-dai, di-dan-dai, di-dan-dai. Hai-dan-dai, di-dan-dai, dai-do. Hai-da-na-nai, na-na-nai, ya-na-nai, nai-nai-nai. Any nai yana nai yana nai 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 nam la 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 yana nai yana nai ya 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 iri nai nai nam Idandai, dadandai, didandai, idandai, dididai, didai, idandai, nanandai, nanai, nai. Anai, nai, na, nai, 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 no. Hi, special friends. That nigun, that melody is Ve'inenu Tirena. Our eyes one day will see. And it's a question for us. What do our eyes hope to see one day? What is it that we long to one day see? Friends, I want to share the sad news that one of our regulars here from the last few years has passed away. Rabbi Barry Dove Lerner, who was joining our sessions here for years, these Tuesday classes. I just learned passed away, and I shared a nice tribute with his family of what it meant for him to be with us in this learning space. I didn't know him much beyond this learning space, but I got a sense of his humility and his wit and his intellectual intrigue and was able to share that with the family. So if you knew him or had any experience with him in the sessions and you want to feel free to write a little tribute in the chat, feel free to do so. But today we'll dedicate our learning to him because he was very much a regular here with us. So wonderful friends, before we jump into Jeremy Bentham today in session 18 of the early 19th century, I want to start with a poll as usual to get our personal thoughts flowing together. Is happiness the goal of life? Option one, yes, there's nothing more morally important than happiness, mine and others. Option two, no, happiness is overrated, a terrible measure of a successful life. Option three, happiness is important, but certainly not a top priority. Okay, let's see what folks, give them another few seconds here. Okay, 13% say yes, there's nothing more morally important than happiness, mine and other people's. 13% say no, happiness is overrated, a terrible measure of a successful life. And 75% happiness is important, but certainly a top priority. Okay, let's see where Jeremy Bentham comes in on this. And hopefully in the conversation, you'll feel free to continue to weigh in on that as that, however that resonates for you. So friends, is happiness the most important thing in life? What should be our measure of success on our work to heal the world? Are we just as responsible for people on the other side of the world as we are to our own children? The English thinker Jeremy Bentham arrived at what he believed to be an overarching answer to most questions of morality as the father of utilitarianism, an idea so profound to him that it caused him to leave a promising career in law to pursue his philosophical work. Utilitarianism is a philosophy in which an action is right if it tends to promote happiness or pleasure, and wrong if it tends to produce unhappiness or pain, not just for the performer of the action, but also for everyone else affected by it. That is to say, that utilitarians seek to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. According to Bentham, human behavior is motivated by the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of pleasure. That's what drives people to do what they do. Every choice of what we eat and what we spend our time doing and is our, according to Bentham, our desire for pleasure and avoiding pain. This is the primary criterion for deciding moral issues, the utility of a pursuit to generate happiness and reduce suffering. Bentham begins chapter 1 of his work, Principles of Morals and Legislation, by writing, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They alone point out what we ought to do and determine what we shall do. The standard of right and wrong and the chain of causes and effects are both fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, all we say, all we think. Now, in addition to thinking about whether you think he's intellectually right, think for a moment also of whether you think he's personally right. Think about the three things you feel motivated to do today, and ask yourself why you feel motivated to do them. And, are they, according to Kant, as we talked about, motivated by duty, or is it ultimately really, motivated by pain and pleasure, as Bentham would argue? This rests on what philosophers would call a hedonistic approach. Today in 21st century America, being a hedon or engaged in hedonistic activity is an accusation. That's a negative thing. But he means something positive here, right? His hedonistic approach, not hedonism referring to an amoral selfishness, but simply that pleasure is the measure of accounting for goodness in the world, right? In this respect, hedonism is rooted in equality. No one person's pleasure is more valuable than another's. The pleasure of a philosopher taking joy in lofty discourse is not privileged over that of someone in poverty finding pleasure in a satisfying meal. The goal is pleasure, however people find it. With the egalitarian nature of utilitarianism, it follows that while it would be best to make everyone happy, when not possible, it's preferable to make the many happy rather than just the few. One of the main benefits to such a system is its simplicity. Instead of needing to make complex moral decisions based on a mastery of a particular religious tradition or expertise in moral philosophy, we can simply think of how to bring the most pleasure to the most people. This can enable us to avoid confusion in morality, which often leads to us giving up and accepting injustices. Bentham's system, on the other hand, equips everyone, including the government, to make moral calculations that generally benefit the masses. And so, in addition to being pro-equality, utilitarianism is pro-democracy, allowing people to hold legislators accountable to the overall public and not simply to a small group of elites. One word that summarizes the ideas at play here is consequentialism. Bentham cares not about the intentions behind a person's actions, but the consequences. Whether a person means well is irrelevant if the consequences themselves bring about greater suffering. So what should a Jew make of utilitarianism? Well, at its most basic level, it sounds like a great idea. What is tikkun olam if not an attempt to repair the world on a macro scale? Why would we not want to do the most good for the most people? We, of course, by and large, want people to be happier and suffer less. However, there are important ways in which Judaism rejects a utilitarian ethic. For example, there's the Jewish value that every human has infinite dignity. Each life is an entire universe. Therefore, we cannot hold as a rule that two lives are more valuable than one life. Infinity plus infinity still equals infinity. Further, there are religious and moral principles that prevent utilitarian calculations. For instance, the rabbis make clear that you cannot kill one innocent person to save two, assuming this is not an instance of self-defense. Take the famous trolley problem. Remember the trolley case? To review, a hypothetical trolley is heading down a track and bound to kill 5 people. You have the option to pull a lever to divert the trolley to a path on which it will run over and kill 1 person instead. Should you cause the trolley to kill 1 person in order to save 5? For a utilitarian, the choice is not difficult at all. You send the trolley to kill the 1. In Jewish morality, it's more complicated. In fact, a similar case is discussed by the Jerusalem Talmud. Here's what it says. It was stated a group of people on the road were met by Gentiles, hostile, who were being hostile, who said to them, "Give us one of you that we may kill him. Otherwise, we shall kill all of you. Even if all of them are killed, they should not hand over a single person." From this, it appears that Jewish law would prohibit one from pulling the lever, thereby killing one person to act to save five. However, halachic authorities have debated this question without clear agreement. Yet, rather than focusing exclusively on the consequences, they tend to analyze the act itself and explore whether the consequences are inherent to the act or can be seen as separate from it. I hope that makes sense. So, just to flesh that a little further, they seem pretty unanimous that if you can actively kill one to save five, you cannot actively kill one to passively save five. However, the legal maneuver they're making is saying, well, there is a distance between me changing tracks and the person being run over. It is not a direct consequence, such as me punching someone in the face or pushing someone off a bridge. I'm changing tracks, but a few seconds later, the train hits the people. Yes, it's inevitable, but it's not a direct consequence of my physical action of hitting the button. And Jewish law is interested in that direct act. The essential difference between Bentham and Judaism is that he more or less viewed people as represented by totals of happiness, points in a game. In Judaism, we see that the root of a person goes deeper than the pleasures they accumulate. They are made in God's image and they should be treated as such. Bentham, by contrast, famously said, natural rights is simple nonsense. Natural and imprescriptible rights, rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts, right? So many of us might believe in human dignity, the notion that humans are innately valuable. They're not just valuable, their pleasure is not valuable. It's not just that we care about someone's pleasure, we care about the person themselves. And because we care about them, we care about their pleasure. Bentham says, no, we don't care about the person. There's no innate dignity. We're just animals, and we have pleasure and pain, and we should care about each other's pleasure and pain because we care about our own pleasure and pain. And that's what morality is kind of about. Also, recall the way utilitarianism cares more about consequences than intention. This isn't foreign to Judaism either. We have the trope that Judaism is concerned primarily with actions. And yet we should understand that Judaism cares very much about intentionality. Yes, we want to do the right thing regardless of thoughts and beliefs. All things being equal, kavanah does matter, both religiously and ethically. For example, Jewish law does not treat intentional murder as the same as unintentional murder, unintentional killing, even if both have the same consequences. We understand the mitigating factor to be real. The Torah specifies that one who killed another accidentally is not sentenced to death, but rather allowed to take refuge in special cities, the Arei Miklat, designed for that purpose. It's a place of rescue, of refuge for those who accidentally kill. Someone who is driving their car carefully and accidentally, gets in an accident and kills someone is treated very differently than someone who breaks into a home with a gun, So utilitarianism and its focus on consequences does not always equal justice. So too, Maimonides posited that when giving tzedakah, when giving charitably, is it better to give just one coin every day than to give a massive sum of money all at once? Excuse me, that was a statement, not a question. According to Maimonides, it's better to give one coin every day than give a large amount at once. Why is that? Because for him, it's not just about the practical consequences of the mitzvah, the greatest impact you can have charitably, but also about the effect the mitzvah has on the human soul. Still, these Jewish ideas are no excuse for not considering the impact of our actions. The Talmud famously asks, who is the one who is wise? And answers, the one who can foresee the consequences of their actions. That's a wise person, according to that one of those answers in Pirkei Avot. excuse me. I mean, it does emerge in Pirkei Avot, but that particular idea is in the Tractate of Tamid. It's not sufficient to think that one's actions are justified in an abstract sense, but one must also strive to think through their impact on themselves and others. When discussing gun control, a contemporary rabbi has argued that Jewish values dictate that our laws should be based on utilitarian consequentialism, backed by statistics, rather than more acutely focused on rules. Here's how he argued. Rabbeinu Nisim, 14th century Spain, writes that when evaluating the prohibition of whether to sell weapons, we need to look at the total result. If more harm than good will result from the sale of weapons, then we should not sell the weapons. All right, so just to unpack that a little bit, the way that most Jews talk about gun control versus gun rights is they look at rules in the Talmud. They say, look, Jews are allowed to own weapons. They should have gun rights. Or they say, look, Jews put restrictions on selling guns, on not guns, but on other forms of weapons, obviously. And so they look at rules and historical precedents. According to a different approach based on this 14th century Spanish thinker, don't look at those historical precedent of rules. Look at the consequence today. If we loosen gun laws, is there more death or less death? If we make stricter gun laws, is there more death or less death? Make it a purely statistics-based rule, rather than arguing based on the Constitution that you have the right to have guns, or rather that voting on, some general assessment that guns are, leading to more death and that stricter gun laws will do it. Be statistics-based. And so that's a very different way of thinking about policy issues based on consequence rather than based on principle. So at its core, the dissonance between Bentham and Jewish thought is that utilitarianism relies unwaveringly on the idea that the end purpose of life is pleasure. As Jews, we see a plurality of goals, such as being of service to God and to people, improving one's character, fulfilling one's responsibilities, seeking meaning in life, and connecting to God by doing mitzvot. Personally, my notion of truth is not attached to ideas that give me, or at least I try not to be attached to ideas that give me pleasure and reduce pain. I mean, that would be a very weak form of seeking truth, that we only embrace the truths that make us feel good. But most of us seek meaning, and sometimes meaning hurts, right? Sometimes we seek meaning and we seek truth, even though we wish we could attach ourselves to a conclusion that made us feel better. According to some utilitarians, it's best to spend one's efforts helping those with the greatest need, even if they live far away from us. However, we do believe the world simply works better if we see ourselves as more responsible to our children than we are to a stranger, and more responsible to a local community member than we are to someone across the world. In the philosophy of Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, we see goodness as a simple calculation. In Judaism, however, we know that the human soul goes so much deeper. Okay, friends, I'm going to pause there. So we've opened up a whole bunch of ideas around the early stages of utilitarianism. As we're going to see in other thinkers, utilitarianism expands and adapts in new ways. Utilitarianism, as we see in 2023 America, is different than early 19th century Jeremy Bentham in many ways, but a lot of the principles remain intact. And so some of our conversation today is around intention versus consequences, is around is our pleasure and pain primary as our moral goals, and many other things he raised. So, as always, love clarification questions, love agreements or disagreements with Bentham's ideas, and any other directions you want to go. Yes, hi, Cheryl.
Hi. I'm sorry about Rabbi Lerner. It's very sad. Earlier this summer, I was in Japan, and the whole concept of happiness actually came up early on in a discussion with our guide, because I said, being on a very nice tour and, having a wonderful time, I said, this whole country seems devoted to happiness. And he said, there's no happiness here. They have sacrificed happiness for authoritarianism. I mean, it's more like they've given up their they've given up a certain amount of their pleasure. I mean, and then if you look closer, I mean, I could see as a tourist, I'm seeing it one way, obviously. But I thought it was very, he said he had lived there for several, he's Canadian and lived there for a while. And he said, I wouldn't live back here. I love, touring around and helping people and taking people, but I wouldn't live here. It's extremely difficult life to live in because they've sacrificed so much. And once you examine it much closer, but from an outsider's point of view, what I saw is the beauty, and everything is so beautiful and everything is so precise. I mean, everything looks like it's geared towards your inner peace and your outer pleasure, that kind of thing. But I just thought it was very interesting having having seen this and my reaction versus his reaction.
So what was his reaction again?
He said he wouldn't live there again. He said they've given it up. They've sacrificed happiness. That's what he said. I mean, there's so many, and then he, when he enumerated them, and as our tour progressed, I saw what he meant. I mean, I understood more of what he meant. The living conditions, the workspace, the authoritarianism with regard to the employer-employee relationship, family life, all of those things. There was like that little bit of an edge that came in and sucked out whatever I perceived as happiness that really wasn't there. So I mean, when you're talking about happiness today, that's the first thing that popped into my head, is that having just seen this other culture and thinking one thing and having the reality posed to me another way was very interesting. Right. So I awesome. mean, Bentham would not have appreciated it. He would have liked my point of view. So.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, I mean, this is a great point, because happiness is such a loaded word, and what makes one person happy and makes another is totally different often. And certainly culturally, as we look at different cultures and ages and experiences, what makes one person happy versus another, and how do we account for the subjectivity of that? And yet Bentham thought that as it looked at pain and pleasure, just one dimension of happiness, that those were kind of objective and measurable in some sense. And so so here's, by the way, here's a quote I'm going to read by Toni Morrison, maybe you've heard before. And again, she may have a different notion of happiness than we do. She writes, please don't settle for happiness. It's not good enough. Of course you deserve it, but if that's all you have in mind, happiness, I want to suggest to you that personal success devoid of meaningfulness, free of a steady commitment to social justice, that's more than a barren life. It's a trivial one. And so similar to what Aglaya's writing over there, this notion of what are we willing to give up? Yeah, and as what Cheryl's saying in Japan, when might we go too far, right, in giving certain things up? And yet, what are we willing to give up for the collective? Do I give up some personal happiness for collective happiness? And how do we balance that? What does it mean to be in a family or be around people who don't make us happy, but we think it's good to be in the relationship? These are complicated issues. Okay, Cheryl, thanks for raising that. Aglaya.
Okay, so first of all, all right, I'm really sad about Rabbi Lerner, so bear with me, please, okay? But also, the historian in me is, well, first of all, the historian in me is like, I'm the one who said, it's pretty obvious, I'm the one who said happiness is overrated. And it's because of the fact that, well, Jeremy Bentham is kind of correct. People do respond to this, and that's the one of the banes of my existence as a historian. I have a job because of this, and that's kind of why I'm kind of like, okay, yeah. But the other thing, though, is that, yes, thank you, Sarah, exactly. That's where I was going to go. But the other thing, though, is that it depends on how I have something that is kind of sensitive, and I don't know if it's going to trigger people if I say this. So I don't know if people want to hear the story about how I got pissed off at a room full of white people and then a room full of Black people in the same week. Votes. Who wants to hear this story? Anybody? Okay, I have a couple of votes who are like, yeah, I want to hear this. Okay, so first off, talking about how people, making people feel better and what's the useful thing to do. Okay, so I'm sitting around God help me. Okay, so I'm sitting around the room full. This is a room full of white people, okay? Now there's one other person of color in the room besides me. And they're all talking about how we're talking about, of all things, like, how do we like handle cultural, multicultural things, that kind of stuff. And they're all talking about, well, we don't have a whole lot of people of color like applying for jobs to work with children of color, that kind of stuff, and how all of this stuff. So I finally, other person of color and I are sitting on this side of the room, not saying a word. And so finally I decided I have to raise my hand and just jump into this, because what they were talking about is recruit people of color to work with people, specifically to work with people of color. And I was like, I think you guys are overestimating what you're talking about. You don't understand the differences between, and like people of color, like they're not all linked. They're not in some sort of board collective and everything. A+ to anyone who knows what I'm talking about, board collective. But anyway, but the thing is that, yay, Sarah. Okay. So then before I could get my point made, a couple of people jumped in and completely silenced me and said, oh no, we've already thought about that. See, these are the steps that we're going to take. They're in the right direction and everything. And I was like, oh my gosh. And they were talking about how they knew so much about it. They already understood that they were making the right move. But here's the thing that I was trying to explain to them, no, you're not making the right move. And I have personal experience for why this is not the right move. Academia, need I say more? Okay, all of the stuff that they've done, to like people of color in academia. I was like, okay, but then people of color go to conferences and they're subjected to racial slurs by other PhDs. Come on, please. So then after that, though, I tried to interrupt them again and say, hold up, you don't have more experience than I do in this, trust me. And I got yelled at. And I got told that I'm the one who's impeding diversity, because I'm the one who's not actually willing to understand their experiences with this, and they know more than I do. Now, also bear in mind, a lot of these people had no PhDs, and a lot of these people were a lot younger than I was and everything, so it degenerated from there. Then I go to another conference, and there are a room full of Black people there, and they're trashing this man who was giving, a talk about, well, he was a person who's not an academic, and he's talking to a bunch of academics. And he was talking about his work on a project that explains lynching, the history of lynching in the United States. And he was going from a kind of mathematical, like Silicon Valley kind of way, because he was a former Silicon Valley person who got interested in history. He just said, Silicon Valley sucks and I got to get out of here. And then, okay, so he was white appearing, but he was not a white man though, but he was white appearing, and he's gay. And he's not an academic. And so what they were yelling, these women who were in this room, like the room full of Black women, they were all saying he's not emotional enough. And then they started trashing him. And I said, wait a minute, I've done the historical research, a lot of historical research in here, because they weren't academics in the history field. And I said, it's also a lot of emotional commitment to deal with history. That's why he was trying to go at it from this point of view, this very mathematical point of view, though, because emotional history, though, there's a lot of judgment on you for being emotional, especially when you're in a room full of professors. He may as well have been me. Okay, like seriously, he may as well, because they judge you if you're a woman and you start tearing up and everything. And so then they said, well, I'm sick. And one of them said, well, I'm sick and tired of these people talking about racial stuff, and it doesn't even affect them. And I said, it affects us all. And I said, you're sitting there with coffee and a cell phone. Okay. Do you know where your cell phone was made? It was made, with minerals that fund genocidal regimes. It was made in a sweatshop. Come on. Your clothes are made in sweatshops and everything. Well, then they sat there. They all got silent very quickly. And then one of them just says to me, well, I think there are different degrees of, accountability. And I was just like, oh my. So the point that I'm making here is, when it comes to the utilitarian aspect, how many ways in which, okay, just thinking of happiness, it makes people happy to believe that they're not as accountable as other people, and that they already have a plan, and that their plan is going to work. All of this stuff. So yeah, for me, when it comes to talking about what makes people happy, a lot of things are making people happy. They're not even aware. They think that they're doing something good, that they're doing something that's going to like actually improve things, when really they're just Jeremy Bentham, all over again. I don't know. Like, it's hard for me to like get it out though, but you see what I'm saying? Understand?
Yeah, Galea, thank you for sharing those stories and seeing how this plays out in frustrating ways for yourself. And yeah, how these same calculations of what he's talking about are still playing out in some of these messy areas today. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that or move in a different direction. But yeah, that's a lot for us to think about. Thank you. Yeah, hey Gary.
Good morning, everyone. I know a lot about various religious practices, but are we talking about if I walked into a Unitarian church is the same as what we're talking about here as utilitarianism?
Oh, sorry, no.
No, okay. I just wanted to make sure
Yeah.
my mind was thinking something else. So I just wanted a clarification there.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I don't have to
Yeah,
be sorry.
the UUC church is a partner via local ones, at least, to the work we do. And yeah, let me just put it in the chat over here on the side. The Unitarian, and that's kind of like a more progressive branch of Christianity today, theologically and politically. Whereas the utilitarian, did I spell it right? No, not at all.
Yeah, I'm familiar with them. Yeah.
Yeah, and so different, and I think the Unitarians would not be utilitarians.
Okay.
I think
I
that
just needed a definition there.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, I think that we largely politically still live in a world of ideology. While philosophers, claim many today to be post-ideology, which is close to impossible. The politically, people generally say, hey, I'm a liberal, and so I check the boxes of X, Y, and Z. I'm a conservative, I check the box of A, Y, and Z. I'm a centrist, so I check the boxes of X, Y, and Z. Utilitarianism wouldn't fall out with either political party. It would take each issue and require kind of a process of discovery of the pain and pleasure involved. So Unitarians are certainly, ideologically driven, and utilitarianism in some ways is an attempt to go beyond that. In some ways that could even be helpful for some of our political divides today. To say, look, I understand ideologically that I'm torn on whether to give an example, a political example right now or not. One of the hard parts is that it's impossible. I don't know if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer and you're wondering about the atomic bomb, it's such one of the things that those who advocated for the atomic bomb being dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as atrocious as that was they argued that this is going to lead to less death. They took a utilitarian approach that said there's over 100,000 people who are being killed in this atrocious way. It's actually going to lead to less death in two ways. One, it's going to end this war, and more than that number of people will die if it continues, which is a dubious claim. But and secondly, that it's going to be an end to all war, which of course was false also, because once people just are holding nukes at each other, they're not going to want to fight with each other because of how much it can escalate. Nonetheless, there's no way to assess that because that's history and a decision was made. But today, there are some ways to politically assess if a policy works. And it would be interesting experiment to engage a more statistics-rooted approach rather than an ideology-based approach on some of these issues. Anyway, Sarah, over to you.
Good afternoon. From where I'm sitting. So two things struck me as we talked. We'll start with the intro, which was pain and pleasure. And I immediately went to Musar. And I thought, so if we're looking at any trait, we're looking at pain on one end and pleasure conceivably on the other, if we're to use that way of thinking. Those extremes of experience as we delve into finding ourselves balanced in each and every trait. And that was the first thing that struck me was like, pain and pleasure, that's it. Then I immediately went to, as soon as we started talking about happiness, I went back to Buddha. And while Buddha talked about suffering as our way of being in the world, and the fact that all of us suffer, when we get metta, the ultimate blessing, so to speak, one of the first phrases is, may all beings be happy. And it doesn't mean, oh boy, I get to get whatever that is. That's not happiness. So contextually, I'm still back at the question of what is happiness? And is it about that moment of joy? Or is it about that sense of peace and calm and being centered and being in touch with our essential being, which is perhaps, I would like to believe, connected to the infinite, and that all of us are interconnected in that way. And that, for me, is genuine happiness. So I'm complete.
Great. Sarah, thanks so much. A lot there. Thanks for bringing us back to the Buddha, which was that our first or second session? Our second session. Good memory, Glea. And those are fascinating comments. And as human beings who are animals, but are also potentially more than animals, we know that we're meaning-making beings. And for example, loneliness, is a problem. Loneliness is a problem. But also there's people existentially who've been able to make meaning of loneliness in a way that brings them great happiness. That their loneliness actually adds depth to their life in a sense. And that's true for lots of things. A loved one dying is a sad thing, but many people find it very meaningful to grieve, to connect, to mourn. And as beings of meaning, things that are losses can also be gains in so many ways. And so if it was only pain and pleasure and not some kind of higher, assessment, that would be missing a big part of this. On the other hand, as we say in Musar as well, that the physical needs of another are my spiritual needs, which is the way, say, that the primary way to be spiritually fulfilled is not through meditation and prayer, nothing against those things, but by addressing the physical needs of another human being. And so we care about their pain and pleasure as our own kind of spiritual assessment. Rabbi Yisro Salanter, on the subjectivity of kind of pain and pleasure, the founder of Musar, said that when a child's toy breaks, we should view it as an adult, like our factory burned down, right? Which is to say, like, don't treat it as trivial. Oh, this girl's doll just broke. Oh, this boy's truck just broke, or whatever it was. But view this as like, in their world, this is like your whole business just got destroyed. And if we think of pain and pleasure like that, like, oh yeah, your pain and pleasure is different than mine, but I take yours as seriously as mine. And so even if we're meaning-making systems, and we say pain and pleasure is a kind of a lower level of human experience, if we were to say such a thing, we still don't dismiss it. We still account for it. We still care about people's physical well-being and health, in addition to their deeper seeking of meaning. But again, a lot of this also touches on what kind of intervention do we want to make in the world? When we talk about healing the world, what is it we want? Do we want to cure disease? Do we want to alleviate suffering in the streets? Do we want people to sign on to an ideology or think differently? Right? People are selling very different approaches as to what it means to heal the world. And that's a good question for us. If we were to measure the success of the impact you want to have on the world, how would we measure that? Would it be based on reducing pain? Maybe if I'm a doctor, I would assess it that way, reducing pain. Or if I was working in preventative care, maybe I would assess it, differently. If I was working on cures, I would assess it differently. Anyways, so thank you for that. And so much more to discuss. Okay, Steve, Gary Gartzman, Ed, Jeff, Eddie, Alex. Hi, Steve.
Hi. I love Sarah's talk about happiness. and this might be unfair, but in my small segment of my life, which is taking care of older than me folks, there is no happiness. It is managing unhappiness. It is just enduring. And I find that more and more, and maybe that's a bad example to bring up because it is such a small segment of our daily lives. And I was trying to think, I'm trying to recall the other thing that I wanted to bring up, like this is totally unrelated. Morality. What is morality? Is morality something determined by a religious relationship, or is it something that we just know because of the society in which we live?
Right.
That's it.
Yeah, Steve. Wow. Okay, so that second question is one we're dancing around this whole series, really, of like, why do we think what's moral is moral, even as we know that different cultures think of it differently, different time periods thought of it differently? How much of this is based on our own needs or our own upbringing versus kind of some assessment? People who watch CNN all day have a very different sense of morality than people who watch Fox News all day, and that's worth thinking about. Like, how does that happen that even in America, we're totally split on what's moral? There's some general consensus that, it would be more moral to hold the door for a stranger than to slam it in their face, basic notions of interpersonal decency. But as we move from interpersonal decency to kind of collective policy, we're going to have massive disagreements about what matters. What also touching on aging, Steve, I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm sure we all know people who are in their 90s and are very, very happy. But Steve's assessment may also resonate for us that many people who are deep into the aging process are often very unhappy because they're isolated, because they have pain, because they don't have a hope for a future. They don't have ambition to kind of be involved in things. Their life is managed for them. Steve, maybe you want to add to that list. And and in fact, this is one of the reasons that very controversially, the utilitarians say, let them all die. Let them all die, right? Because they say, look at healthcare costs in America. The amount we spend on end-of-life care for people who are miserable already is astronomical. And wouldn't that money go better to saving more lives of younger people? And so to people who think every life has infinite dignity, they would find this atrocious. Say, what do you mean? I don't care if the person's 95 and miserable. Their life doesn't matter any more than 10 children, right? And a utilitarian would say, yeah, 10 children matters more than that person, objectively, and that person's miserable anyways. So Steve, so thanks for bringing that up. And it's something for us all to think about. Okay, Gary Gartzman, Ed Iwata, Jeff, Alex, Eddie, anyone who didn't weigh in yet, if you want to, love to hear from you. Yes, hi Cheryl. Then I see Aglaya, unless somebody else jumps in who hasn't spoken yet. Yeah, Cheryl.
I just wanted to comment from personal experience about what Steve just said. Next week, I'm going back to Philadelphia to visit my 97-year-old dad who lives by himself. My sister is, 20 minutes away, but he lives independently. He lives by himself. And he always says, when I ask how he is, he said, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good. And he tells me what he ate. And, he said, I'm playing the hand I was dealt. Whatever happens next. He's not, he kind of indicates that he's ready to die, but he doesn't want to be sick either. So it's interesting how, what his definition of happiness is. He's eating well, he watches movies on TV, he follows the stock market. He does all these things, but I can't say that he's a happy person, that kind of thing. He's looking forward to me coming because I only see him a few times a year. But so that's something, I mean, I told him about it, but he always forgets that I told him. And then he looks at his calendar. But I think, I think that all of these places where elderly people are sent or choose to live, so a lot of them choose to, my father has not chosen to live in one of those. You know, it's like a wait, it's what is it, God's waiting room or something like that. I've heard that. I've heard that expression before. But I have to think, in his own way, he's content. You know, he's content. He says, at least what he says is content. So I'm not sure, you know, I appreciate what Steve was saying, but you know, having, you know, living this with this personal experience, I just wanted to comment on that, you know, he's, you know, I wouldn't want somebody to go in and say, well, he's old, he's lived a long life, and, you know, adios, you know. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. Just before we go to Gary Gartzman, you know, myself, I've had many different experiences with people in kind of late stages of aging. And of course, there's many different experiences involved. I've met many people who are very resentful and cynical and angry, that this is kind of where their life is at, and others who find great meaning and joy in that stage of life. Nonetheless, you know, Cheryl's point, the story stands, and Steve's experience stands. And one of the things to think about it for ourselves, of course, is, do we want more quantity of life or more quality of life? When do we want to sign a DNR at some point, a do not resuscitate, you know, if we think we're going to have a low quality of life? And when my mother was close to passing just over a month ago, I knew she could have been much more present in her last stages, but I over medicated her pain meds, because my goal was not kind of quality of presence in the end, but an absence of pain. And so she was not conscious at all in ways I would have liked her to be. Maybe even she would have liked to have been, but the pain would have been very high. And so that was the decision I made. And those are decisions we often have to make for loved ones. Do we want to resuscitate? Do we want to take a treatment? Do we want to keep going if the quality of life is going to be poor, but there's more life to have? And those are complicated with families too, because sometimes family members feel cheated. Someone says, you're not going to take the treatment. Don't you love me? You know, well, the treatment's going to be very painful, and, you know, and not going to give me a quality of life. Like, don't you love me? That you want to let, you know. And so these are complicated issues of how we engage with families and friends, and how we choose, you know, how we choose to respond to these things. One last comment before go to Gary Gartzman, which is about children. We've been talking about aging, but let's think about children for a moment. What would it look like to educate and parent based upon pleasure being primary, as opposed to it not being primary? And as we're looking at aging, we might say, oh yeah, of course, you know, my 95-year-old parent or friend, all I want for them is not to have pain, right? But is that all we want for our 5-year-old? You know, I certainly wouldn't send them to school, you know, if that was the goal. I think they have a lot more suffering than pleasure in their school experience, they tell me, right? But we have an idea that we want to educate and parent young children in a way that's not always pleasurable, but because there's a higher goal that they're striving towards. I could give them lollipops all day and let them stay in front of their iPad. You know, that would give them tons of pleasure, right? But is that good for them? And that's the same for us. Like, a lot of us do things that don't feel good in preventative healthcare and in other aspects of our lives. But we know it's, maybe you're going to Yom Kippur. How many people are like thrilled to go sit in Yom Kippur and, like, you know, but maybe you are. I mean, you know, but maybe you're not, but you're like, actually fasting is cleansing in some way that's valuable. We do things that don't feel good, right? Okay, Gary Gartzman, over to you.
Well, yeah, we've gone a lot of directions since
yes, we have.
I started with talking about Cheryl's dad. I guess I keep thinking about the Rabbi Sax's writing on the difference between happiness and joy. And while her dad may not be happy in that particular moment, maybe he's taking joy in his adherence to categorical imperatives, such as dealing with what's in front of me one step at a time and facing that and behaving in a certain way. So that's, you know, some kind of a rabbinical comfort to some. But I guess when you kept mentioning dancing around, seems like our whole 40 philosopher series is dancing around. Why are these people spending this much time on this topic?
On
the topic of creating an alternative, almost like creating an alternative to religion. We are all trying to come up with a system by which to live, imperatives, utilitarianism, all these things. What is it that what motivated them? What wasn't good enough about the religion of the time, or not thinking about it at all?
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. I'm so glad you went in this direction. So on your first point, yeah, the happiness versus joy is great. And the rabbis talk a lot about, about distinguishing, with various, Hebrew constructs around these different kinds of things. Think about the single mother who works 3 jobs to put her child through college and is not really enjoying that work, right? But then is sitting there at the college graduation of her daughter, and that feeling she has in that moment and how that connects her life, and all the different pieces of like the hard parts of our lives and how they're connected, our traumas and our glories in so many ways. And yeah, that's worth thinking about for ourselves too. Like, what are just kind of the some of the lower level pleasures that, again, we don't have to dismiss them, but they're not central to our lives. And what are those things that are so deep and central to us that give us a deep sense of, of joy as well? So yeah, so thank you for sharing that. And I think that part of what he was getting to over there as well is that ethical living is what can ultimately bring us to the deepest satisfaction. And living ethically is far from an easy thing or a comfortable, pleasurable thing, but it can be so deeply rewarding. So to go to your point about the alternatives to religion, you're right. All these philosophers are doing one of 3 things in relationship to religion. They're either replacing religion, they're justifying religion, or they're kind of enhancing. So some of the earlier ones we looked at said, my religion is all good and right, but now that philosophy is popular, I need to find some philosophical way to justify why my religion is good, and enhance that. Others are going to say, "Oh my gosh, religion, this is horrible," and even if it's not horrible, people are throwing it out, and so we're going to need some other system. And then that middle group is saying, like, okay, religion got some things right, some things wrong. Philosophies and ethics are going to enhance it and work with it in some way. And so that's going to happen for many reasons. It's going to happen for some people because they don't think religion is true. It's going to happen for some people because they think even if religion is true, it's just not powerful enough to achieve our goals. It's going to happen for some because they think, that religion is good, but it needs to be articulated in a more, nuanced or modern way. And then it's going to happen for some because they think that the religion is fundamentally bad. And so, but at the end of the day, some of the main points that religion was trying to say are held intact, but now we have disagreements. So someone says, okay, the Torah or the Bible says don't kill, don't steal. But now the modern person says, well, what does that mean? Don't kill. Can I go to war? Can I defend myself? Right? Can I pull the plug on someone in end of life care? What does that mean? Don't kill, don't steal. Well, what exactly does that mean? Because now there's a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about, economics. And according to some, taxation is stealing. According to others, taxation is just. And so what does that mean, don't steal? And so, and then don't kill, get into abortion. Pro-life folks say, well, don't kill. Obviously, you can't have abortions. And other people say, no, that's not a life. It's not killing. So even though we have these principles from religion, now everything is called into question. And so a lot of these philosophers are trying to get us to to ask harder questions than we may have. Gary, you want to respond to that?
No, I think that's helpful. I'd have to think about those 3 points of how philosophy interacts. I guess I'd like to see like how Kant or Bentham, how religious were they? I'd like to talk to them and go, what camp do you fall into? Are you trying to replace religion, and why it's just not good enough? Or, religion's pretty good, but it doesn't speak to me in that particular way.
Right.
So if you can arrange a Zoom, that'd be fine.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, love that. And I think that one of the things we know that religion seems capable of today, that religion seems capable of many things today that other systems are not capable of, for better and worse. But some of the good things, we know that community is really dying fast in America, and religion is one of the last places to provide community. Of course, you can find micro community in many ways, but community that takes care of each other, in a sense. It's hard to always find that. And
second, I'm really sorry about this, but please don't underestimate the fact that these philosophers never intended for the masses to actually understand their works.
That's an interesting point too.
Okay, please don't. I'm really sorry.
In fact, some of the philosophers didn't want the masses to understand them. In particular, they really thought the masses are dumb, and there's a few people up top who are actually going to spend their lives thinking. Now, that's changed a lot for a lot of reasons. It used to be, if everyone just worked in agriculture and few people were rich enough to spend their time thinking, or now people retire and they spend a lot of time thinking, right? Or there's longer periods of education, right? So, but by and large, these ideas were meant for a very small group. All right, friends, we're at our time. I need to say 2 things. Number one, our thinker next week is Hegel. Hegel is just a game changer. And secondly, I'm sorry if this messes you up, but next week, as an anomaly, we're going to meet on Monday at our normal time rather than Tuesday. So I'm sorry if that means you can't join us. The recording will be available if you want. But we're going to meet next week at Monday instead of Tuesday, and then we'll get back to our normal Tuesdays. In any case, thank you all so much for joining and for your wonderful insights. And I hope you'll continue to think today about what motivates you, how you think about pain and pleasure, how you think about consequences versus intentions, how that ought to impact how we think about justice, and how central should happiness be in our lives, and what type of happiness. Have a beautiful day.